The buzzing sound of a voicemail echoed through the quiet room. Neil's sharp voice blasted through the speaker. "Listen, Leonard, I already told you. That garage needs to be cleared out by Friday. We need the space. Stop being an obstacle. My son-in-law got my name wrong. He called me Leonard and kicked me out of my own home in 14 seconds. What he didn't know was that I was a structural engineer, and I had seen the collapse of his future 4 years earlier. I listened to that voicemail 40 times. Not because it hurt, but because I wanted to remember exactly how it felt to stand in my own garage and hear him call me an obstacle. My name is Gordon Ashby, but to Neil I was just an outdated structure taking up valuable space in his plans. When a load-bearing beam is pushed beyond its limit, it does not break immediately. It cracks quietly. Those 14 seconds were the first visible crack. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a drink, a few snacks, and get comfortable. Remember, the people in these stories always had every opportunity to do the right thing. They simply chose not to. Leave a comment with the number 1 or tell us which city you are watching from so we can continue the story together. And don't forget to subscribe. You are going to enjoy this one. I spent my entire career calculating the load capacities of skyscrapers. I understand limits better than most people. This house, this land, and this woodworking shop all belong to me. I paid off every debt more than a decade ago. I belong here. Every brick, every piece of timber, every inch of this property. Yet Neil believed he could redefine my entire life in 14 seconds. He thought I was a confused old man who could be swept aside. He forgot one of the most fundamental laws of physics. Every action creates an equal and opposite reaction, and the reaction of a structural engineer is always measured with millimeter precision. To understand why Neil carried that blind confidence, you have to go back to the blueprint drawn 4 years earlier. That was when my daughter Jenna first brought him home. Neil introduced himself as a strategic consultant. He wore expensive suits and spoke with polished confidence. But an experienced engineer does not judge a structure by its paint. He studies the foundation. I began analyzing Neil's load-bearing capacity from the very first day. He had no solid structural assets. What he possessed was an exceptional talent for performance. He talked about million-dollar projects, yet borrowed my old truck whenever he needed to meet a client. A hollow structure always seeks support from stronger structures around it. And I was his target. 4 years ago, Jenna came to me in tears. She said Neil's company was struggling and that cash flow had dried up. Neil sat across from me in the living room. He placed a thick stack of documents on the coffee table filled with complicated charts and projections. He urged me to refinance this house, a home that had been completely paid off for years, and invest the money in his fund. He called it family asset optimization. He promised returns that would guarantee a comfortable retirement. I looked into his eyes. Behind those carefully crafted glasses I saw greed. I agreed. Not because I believed him. Because I saw Jenna smiling. I signed the paperwork. I refinanced the house and released a substantial amount of equity. I willingly placed a dangerous load on the stable financial foundation I had spent decades building. But Neil made a fatal mistake. He confused a father's sacrifice with an old man's stupidity. The moment he received that money, he began acting as if this house already belonged to him. What he did not know was that engineers always keep backup blueprints. When my money started flowing into his accounts, I quietly established an invisible load monitoring system. Neil believed he had outsmarted me. In reality, he had just signed his name to a self-destruct mechanism he did not even know existed. That first deception was only the beginning. It became the first domino in a chain reaction of structural failures that he would personally set into motion, one mistake at a time. Once Neil secured the investment money, he began a quiet takeover. He treated my house as if it were a reward he had earned for a promotion. He started changing things without ever asking for my opinion. First, the leather chairs in the living room disappeared and were replaced with expensive modern sofas. Then the landscape paintings I had loved for years were taken down from the walls. He wanted to erase every trace of me from my own home. Soon, Neil developed a favorite phrase. We need to repaint the workshop. We need to change eating habits because they're unhealthy. But his version of we really meant I want to and you will comply. He stood in my house like a newly crowned king. He controlled my daughter and gradually reduced me to the status of a guest in the place I owned. Neil's arrogance reached its peak when he announced that my woodworking shop should be converted into an entertainment room. That workshop was the only place where I found peace. It was where I kept my father's old Stanley No. 5 handplane, a tool that had survived generations of our family. When Neil walked into the shop, looked at my lumber with open contempt, and declared that the place was nothing but clutter, I felt a surge of tension travel down my spine. It was the feeling of a steel beam approaching its elastic limit. I remained silent as he measured the room and discussed his renovation plans. What he did not know was that the workshop contained far more than wood. It was the control center of the entire property. Every electrical diagram, every plumbing record, and more importantly, every original financial document belonging to the family. All of it was stored there. Neil wanted to destroy the very room that held the key to his downfall. The more confident he became, the colder I grew. My anger never clouded my judgment. The mind of an engineer understands that timing is everything, and every successful trap depends on patience. As Neil paced around the workshop, imagining the future he intended to build, I quietly realized that the moment had finally arrived. He believed he was gaining the upper hand. What he did not realize was that his next move, made during an ordinary family dinner, would trigger a trap I had been preparing in silence for years. A trap designed with the same precision I once used to calculate the load limits of skyscrapers. That dinner was a performance of pure arrogance. Neil sat at the head of the table, a seat that had always belonged to me. He cut into a piece of steak, looked directly into my eyes, and casually announced that the woodworking shop would be demolished the following week. I slowly set down my fork and knife. The sharp clink of metal against porcelain echoed through the room. Then I reminded him of a simple fact. My name was still on the deed to this house. Neil laughed. It was not a nervous laugh. It was the laugh of a man convinced he had already won. He leaned forward and spoke with open contempt. Your name may be on the deed, Gordon, but we're the ones who actually live here. Times have changed. You need to learn how to adapt or step aside. Beside him, Jenna lowered her head and said nothing. My daughter had fallen completely under his influence. The anger inside me did not explode into shouting. An engineer understands that the greatest pressures are often the silent ones. I stood up without another word. Then I walked straight to the woodworking shop. The old yellow work light flickered on, casting long shadows across the walls. I reached for my father's Stanley No. 5 handplane. Time had left a few patches of rust across its steel body. Taking out a sharpening stone, I began restoring the blade. The scraping sound of steel against stone filled the darkness. A craftsman knows that restoring a tool is not much different from restoring a life. To reveal clean steel, you must remove the rust. Completely. Without hesitation. Neil had become the rust attached to my life, and the time had come to remove him. I pushed the plane firmly across a hardwood board. A thin ribbon of wood curled away and drifted onto the floor. Beneath the rough surface, smooth grain emerged. Clean, strong, untouched. I stared at those fresh wood fibers for a long moment. Neil believed victory was already in his hands. He had no idea that his arrogant speech at the dinner table had pushed me toward a final decision. I turned the handplane over and inspected the edge of the blade. It was razor sharp. Tomorrow morning I would begin a complete maintenance review of this house and everything connected to it. And the very first thing on my list would be a careful examination of the bank accounts. Because hidden among those numbers was a secret I had recently discovered. One that possessed the power to throw Neil out of this house almost immediately. And unlike his threats and empty promises, that power was backed by documentation, signatures, and facts. The next morning, I did not go to the woodworking shop. Instead, I drove straight to the office of Patricia Holm. Patricia was a specialist in property law and a longtime friend of mine. I sat across from her and placed 4 years' worth of bank statements on her desk. I need a complete structural inspection of my finances, I said. Patricia adjusted her glasses and began reviewing the records. As her eyes moved across the numbers, her expression changed. A slight frown appeared on her face. A few moments later, she turned her computer screen toward me and pointed at 3 unusual transactions from the previous month. Together, they totaled $2,000. The money had been quietly transferred from my savings account into an unfamiliar corporate account. Whoever authorized the transfers had used my encrypted electronic signature. The problem was simple. On each of those dates, I had spent the entire day in my woodworking shop. I had never touched my computer. Only one person knew my backup passwords and had access to my private office. Neil. He had been secretly siphoning money from my financial foundation to patch the holes in his own failing structure. I leaned back in my chair. A strange calm settled over me. For many people, betrayal by family would have come as a devastating shock. For me, it was merely confirmation. Failure never surprises someone who has spent 4 years studying the load calculations. I had recognized the weakness in Neil's moral framework long ago. These transactions were simply the physical evidence supporting a conclusion I had already reached. He had started stealing because he had reached the breaking point of financial collapse. Neil thought I was a confused old man, an easy target. What he forgot was that I keep records. Detailed records. And now I was holding evidence of what appeared to be a serious financial crime. I looked at Patricia and asked what the next legal steps should be. A cold smile appeared on her face. It was the smile of someone who understood the power of documentation. "Gordon," she said, "this is only the tip of the iceberg." She explained that if I wanted to understand the full extent of what Neil had done, I would need to dig deeper into the business guarantees and financial agreements I had signed for him 4 years earlier. The documents connected to the original investment. The documents I had not examined in years. I nodded and stood up. The restoration of my life had officially begun. Later that afternoon I returned to the woodworking shop. I picked up my father's Stanley No. 5 handplane once again. This time every pass across the wood felt different. No longer an act of patience. No longer a method of endurance. Each precise cut felt like another calculated incision into the foundation of Neil's career. The shavings curled away from the blade and fell to the floor in silent spirals. But when I started sorting through the old guarantee agreements and financial records stored in the workshop, I discovered something far worse than the stolen money. A number. One single number hidden deep inside the paperwork. And the moment I saw it, I felt my stomach tighten. $2,000 was insignificant compared to this. This figure was large enough to destroy Neil completely. Large enough to trigger investigations. Large enough to collapse everything he had built. And most frightening of all, it was large enough to drag my daughter Jenna into the disaster alongside him. For the first time in 4 years, I realized that the structure I was preparing to demolish might contain more than one occupant. The number printed on the old guarantee agreement was $34,000. It was a business debt Neil had taken on 4 years earlier, a debt he had persuaded me to guarantee. He had hidden behind the name of a joint venture company to avoid personal responsibility. But the amount was not the most disturbing part. What froze me in place was the second signature beside my own. Jenna's. My daughter's name was right there on the document. Either she had knowingly participated in the scheme, or worse, Neil had manipulated her into signing a commitment she did not fully understand. I sat motionless in the woodworking shop. The yellow light cast the shadow of my Stanley No. 5 handplane across the wall. The father inside me felt his heart tighten. The structural engineer inside me immediately took control. When a building is in danger of collapse, you cannot sit down and cry. You isolate the damaged section and save the rest of the structure. I needed to separate Jenna from the decaying load that called itself Neil. I began reviewing every asset I owned. The house, the land, the workshop. Everything was legally in my name. Patricia had already secured the documentation proving the unauthorized $2,000 transfers. Every record was preserved, every transaction documented. I carefully sorted invoices, contracts, and financial statements into separate folders. Each document received a label. Each label received a category. Everything was organized with the precision of an engineering blueprint. At that moment, I felt less like a retired engineer and more like a demolition specialist preparing a controlled implosion. A defective structure is never destroyed by random force. The charges are placed at critical connection points. 1 ignition. Maximum effect. Minimum collateral damage. Neil still knew nothing about the dismantling operation underway around him. He continued walking through my house with the confidence of a conqueror. He smiled. He made plans. He gave orders. He had no idea that his countdown had already begun. I locked the filing cabinet and slipped the key into my pocket. Everything was ready for the first day of action. Tomorrow morning, Neil would learn exactly how powerful legal language could be. The official notice I intended to deliver would strike directly at the foundation of his confidence. More importantly, it would force him to reveal his true character in front of Jenna. For the first time, she would be forced to see the man behind the performance. What I did not anticipate was how violently he would react. Engineers spend their careers calculating risk factors and safety margins. But human desperation does not always follow mathematical rules, and Neil's response would exceed every safety tolerance I had ever designed for. Monday morning, I placed the official notice on the dining room table. It was a formal legal document. The notice demanded that Neil repay 4 years of unpaid rent or face eviction proceedings within 30 days. Neil picked up the papers and began reading. The smug confidence vanished from his face almost immediately. His expression twisted with anger. He slammed both hands onto the table, jumped to his feet, and shouted that I had no right to do this. He called me a crazy old man determined to destroy his own family. Beside him, Jenna burst into tears. My daughter pleaded with me to stop. She begged me to think about family. I looked at both of them with the calm, detached gaze of a judge. Then I spoke as evenly as I could. I've been talking for 4 years. Now it's time for action. I maintained this structure through patience. You overloaded it. This is not revenge. This is the legal recovery of my property. Neil immediately declared that he would not leave. Not one step. He threatened to take me to court for harassment. He believed the law was a game of language that could be manipulated by whoever spoke the loudest. What he did not know was that Patricia and I had already calculated every legal step with engineering precision. I turned away and walked out of the room. His insults followed me down the hallway. I ignored every word. Instead, I returned to the woodworking shop and picked up my father's Stanley No. 5 hand plane. The smooth sound of steel gliding across hardwood restored my focus. Another layer of rust was being removed, one shaving at a time. If you've stayed with this story this far, then it has probably stirred at least a few emotions. Take a quick moment to like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've made it this far, and tell me how you think the story will end. I'd love to see whether your prediction is right. It only takes a second, and it means a great deal to us. Neil, however, had no intention of sitting quietly. Within days, he hired his own attorney and began preparing for a prolonged legal battle. He was convinced he could exploit loopholes in old agreements and somehow gain control of my house. The following week, he organized an emergency meeting in my living room. His attorney would attend. Patricia would attend. And Neil intended to prove that I was the one acting irrationally. He sat there with the confidence of a man who believed he had cornered his opponent. What he failed to realize was that Patricia was not coming to discuss rent. She arrived carrying a black briefcase. Inside that briefcase was the ace card I had been waiting to play. A collection of documents, bank records, electronic authorization logs, signed agreements, evidence that pointed towards serious financial fraud. Neil's attorney expected a property dispute. Instead, he was about to discover that the conversation would shift towards something far more dangerous. The moment Patricia opened that black case, the entire direction of the confrontation would change. And for the first time, even Neil's lawyer would begin to wonder whether his client had been hiding something far worse than unpaid rent. The meeting in the living room unfolded beneath a crushing weight of tension. Neil's attorney opened the discussion with the confidence of a man who believed the facts were on his side. He presented arguments regarding residency rights, implied tenancy, and the weaknesses of a rental arrangement that had never been formally documented. Neil sat beside him with his arms crossed. The smug look in his eyes seemed to say the same thing. The old man is finished. I said nothing. I simply watched him. An engineer's silence in front of a structure on the verge of collapse is often the most frightening silence of all. Patricia Holmes slowly opened her black briefcase. She did not challenge their arguments about residency. She did not discuss rental law. Instead, she slid 3 thick folders across the table. The room immediately changed. Inside those folders was evidence of financial fraud, bank records, electronic authorization logs, transaction histories, documents showing that my encrypted electronic signature had been used to transfer money without my authorization. But Patricia was not finished. She opened a second folder and produced additional records. These documents suggested that financial statements connected to the joint venture had been falsified, and that the $34,000 guaranteed debt had been manipulated through deceptive reporting. Every figure was printed in black ink on white paper. Numbers do not become emotional. Numbers do not panic. Numbers do not lie. And these numbers carried the weight of a criminal investigation. The color drained from Neil's face. His smug expression disappeared instantly. The smile vanished. Beads of sweat formed along his forehead. His attorney picked up the documents and began reading. The confidence in the room evaporated. I noticed a slight tremor in the lawyer's hands. He turned several pages, then several more. Finally, he looked at his client. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The attorney quietly closed the folder. When he finally addressed us, his voice was noticeably different. "We need time to review all of this." That was all he said. Within minutes, they were gathering their belongings. The meeting ended without another argument, without another threat, without another speech. Neil left the room looking unsteady, as though a concrete slab weighing several tons had fallen directly onto his shoulders. A sense of satisfaction moved through me. Not because of revenge, because mathematics had once again done what mathematics always does. It revealed the truth. The fraudulent structure Neil had spent 4 years constructing had collapsed in less than 15 minutes. Across the room, Jenna sat frozen in her chair. For the first time, she had seen the man she had spent years defending through someone else's eyes. And what she saw terrified her. Neil was facing financial ruin, potential criminal exposure, the possibility of losing everything. But desperate people rarely behave rationally. When a cornered man sees the walls closing in, he often becomes most dangerous at the exact moment he realizes he is lost. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, I was awakened by an unfamiliar sound. A metallic scrape. Then another. Soft. Deliberate. Coming from the direction of my woodworking shop. I sat up immediately. Years of engineering had trained me to recognize warning signs before disaster struck. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I slipped out of bed and listened carefully. The sound came again. From the workshop. And in that instant I knew exactly who was down there. Neil. Whatever he was doing it in secret. My filing cabinet. The evidence. The documents. Those were the only things he still had reason to fear. I moved toward the door as quietly as possible. A terrible realization formed in my mind. A desperate man trying to destroy evidence rarely considers the consequences. And my workshop contained more than records. It contained tools, electrical systems, flammable materials. If Neil panicked and made one catastrophic mistake, he could trigger a disaster large enough to destroy far more than the evidence he was trying to erase. The entire house might be at risk. And as I descended the dark hallway toward the workshop, I realized that the final collapse of Neil's carefully constructed world had already begun. I walked down to the workshop through the silence of the night. The door stood slightly open. The beam from Neil's flashlight swept frantically across stacks of lumber and shelves of tools. He was tearing through my backup filing cabinet, desperately searching for a way to destroy the original evidence. I did not rush in. I did not shout. Instead, I stood in the doorway and flipped on the main light. The sudden brightness flooded the room. Neil jumped violently and dropped the flashlight onto the floor. It clattered across the concrete. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He stared at me with the eyes of a trapped animal. Cornered, terrified, dangerous. I looked back at him with complete coldness. Then, I delivered the truth. "It's too late, Neil. Copies of every document were delivered to the police this afternoon." The words hit him harder than any physical blow. His shoulders collapsed. The fight drained out of him. He sank to his knees on the workshop floor and began begging. At first he pleaded for mercy. Then he pleaded for another chance. Finally he invoked Jenna's name. He begged me to think about my daughter, to think about family. But some structures become too compromised to repair. Every engineer knows that. Once the foundation fails, restoration is no longer possible. Only removal remains. I took out my phone, and I called the police. The following morning, a patrol car pulled into the driveway. Neil was escorted from the property for questioning regarding the financial fraud investigation. Jenna stood on the front porch, watching the vehicle disappear into the morning fog. She cried openly. When she turned toward me, there was anger in her eyes. She accused me of being cruel. I placed a hand on her shoulder and looked directly at her. Then I spoke quietly. "You cannot protect someone from the consequences of their own actions by sacrificing yourself." The words seemed to cut through years of confusion. Jenna fell silent. For the first time in a long while, she truly listened. A few days later, she packed her belongings. Shortly afterward, she filed for legal separation. The collapse of the structure called Neil was finally complete. My house was free of the intruder who had spent years trying to claim it. The silence returned, the peace returned, and so did I. I went back to the workshop and cleaned the mess Neil had left behind. The overturned boxes, the scattered paperwork, the broken lock on the filing cabinet. When everything was finished, I picked up my father's Stanley No. 5 handplane. I carefully wiped away the dust that had settled across the steel. The blade gleamed beneath the light. Bright, clean, without a trace of rust. At last the restoration of my life felt complete. For the first time in years, I believed I could simply enjoy the peace I had earned. But peace has a strange way of announcing its departure. The evening before I planned to lock the workshop for the night, I noticed an envelope lying just inside the doorway. Someone had pushed it through the gap beneath the door. There was no return address, no name, no explanation. I opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph. A recent photograph of my workshop, taken from outside the property, taken without my knowledge. Attached to the photo was a single handwritten note, only one sentence. The moment I read it, my heartbeat quickened. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a warning that suggested Neil's collapse might not have been the end of the story after all. Someone else had been watching, and whoever sent that photograph knew far more about my life than they should have. I opened the envelope with the careful precision of an engineer. The handwriting inside belonged to Jenna. My daughter had written a long overdue apology. She explained that she had found a new job in another city and was starting over. The photograph of the workshop taken from outside the property was not a threat at all. It was her way of telling me that she still treasured the place where I had always found peace. The tension in my chest eased immediately. The load I had been carrying for years finally lifted. At last, every chapter of the ordeal had come to an end. My home had regained its balance. Saturday mornings once again followed the original blueprint. I sat in the kitchen with my young granddaughter Phoebe. The amber glow of a Tucson sunset shimmered across a plate of blueberry pancakes. Phoebe's laughter echoed through the house. Warm, bright, alive. The family structure had finally been restored after the defective materials were removed. Later, I stood alone in the woodworking shop. The polished steel of my Stanley No. 25 plane reflected the workshop lights. The rust called Neil was gone, completely gone. A structure can only survive storms when it stands on a solid foundation and is supported by honest pillars. Thank you for joining me on Dad's Real-Life Revenge. If this story resonated with you, share your own experiences in the comments and subscribe so you do not miss future stories and the lessons hidden within them. The greatest lesson I learned after 4 years of endurance is surprisingly simple. Never confuse love with obligation. Never confuse generosity with surrender. If you find yourself trapped beneath a structure that is crushing your spirit, learn when to step back. Do not allow your kindness to become the foundation of someone else's exploitation. Every relationship has a safe load limit. When that limit is exceeded, decisive action becomes the only way to protect yourself and the people you truly love. And above all else, keep the blade of your life sharp. A sharp blade removes rot. A sharp blade reveals strength. A sharp blade allows you to build something better. As I switched off the workshop lights and closed the door behind me, I looked back one final time. The structure had survived. The foundation remained strong, and for the first time in many years, the future felt as steady as the ground beneath my feet.